Welcome to session 4 of this new series, Understanding Anger 2.0. This is sort of a reprise of a talk series that I did years and years and years ago in person at the Kingston Public Library, hosted on Saturdays like it is in the present, but this time we're doing things virtually. And this series is going to be looking at anger as depicted or described or even examined in greater depth in a number of different authors and works from antiquity all the way up to, well, we'll see how far we get, maybe into the early modern, maybe even into the late modern period. Because of this online format, we can do this as long as we like. And the text that I picked out for today is the Iliad. And there's some good reasons why I wanted to address that early on. And the first is that it is a work that is not just involving and describing and depicting anger. It is a work that is centered around anger or wrath, or however you want to talk about it. The very, very first line, and I'll be using the Robert Fagel's translation for this. It begins with an invocation to the Muses to sing of the wrath or the rage, the menace of Achilles. And so it takes as its starting point for the story when the two, namely Achilles and Agamemnon, first clashed. Agamemnon, lord of men or commander of men, and godlike or brilliant Achilles, and both of them get angry, and their anger is going to have monumental consequences for the Achaeans or Greeks who are massed at Troy in the 9th year of the war, or actually really the 10th year of the war. They've been there 9 years, and there's going to be all sorts of other interesting depictions of anger. And we could think about the Iliad. I mean, sometimes people will try to make an analogy between Homer's works and Hesiod's works, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Works and Days, the Theogony and stuff like that, and they'll call it the Greek Bible. Not quite correct. It's not as if they were, you know, constantly orienting themselves by these sacred scriptures or something like that. They did do a lot of proof texting. If Plato is to be trusted, people would bring up those, but they'd also bring up lines from other poets, Simonides and people like that. But the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then, you know, next month we're going to be looking at Hesiod, Works and Days. They had massive cultural impact on the ancient Greeks. And so we do see them, you know, these works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the characters in them, the speeches, getting addressed by other people who are interested in the issue of anger. And so I think it's really worth digging into it to see not sort of lessons, because there aren't lessons being taught as such about anger, but we could say observations, how it's being depicted, how it's being described, when anger is arising. And this can be very useful for us as we move forward. And, you know, this is our first foray into Greek poetry. I think a lot of people know that the Odyssey, the Iliad are actually written in, you know, a rhyme scheme, not end rhyme, but rather meter. And this was, you know, considered very important for the ancient Greeks. It was an art form, and we're talking about epic poetry here. We're going to be looking at, you know, later on down the line, some what is called lyric poetry. And of course, the tragedies are another type of poetry as well. And, you know, one of the things that you can say about the poets, if you haven't been totally turned off from them by Plato and his criticisms of his fellow poets, because he was a poet originally, is that the poets provide us with some useful reflections on anger that are hard won and thought out, that provide us with starting points for thinking about this difficult emotion, particularly within the context of conflict and warfare. So that's all quite important to think about. And a few general remarks that we could say. The Iliad is set back in the heroic or Bronze Age. They actually use the word hero in there at a number of points in the Greek. But there's not a lot of idealizing going on. Oftentimes when we think about the good old days and the, great warriors and stuff like that, for example, American history tends to get a lot of whitewashing. And, George Washington was this really wonderful guy. He actually wasn't. He wasn't a great guy. He was okay at holding an army together. He lost most of his battles. The whole thing about the cherry tree and I shall never tell a lie. We know that's complete confabulation. Homer is not like saying with the ancient Greek heroes, oh, look at wonderful Achilles. What a great guy he is. So rational, so willing to sacrifice one for the team. No, I mean, these people are being depicted as, in some cases, real jerks. And there isn't a single good guy in the whole story. They've all got flaws. So that's kind of cool to think about. And, this is a time in which the gods are also involved in human affairs pretty closely. We see the gods actually getting into conflict with each other over this Trojan War, the war between the massed Grecian or Achaean host with all of these great, leaders of their own little principalities massed against the Trojans, who have called upon their own allies before and are now hemmed in their city. Two different, groups, the Trojans in their city, the Greeks by the ships in their camps. And it is a warrior culture that we're looking at. So we should expect that anger is going to be a really central part of what is going on. We're going to see later on Agamemnon himself getting angry as he goes up and down the ranks of those fighting. If he sees a man falling out, getting upset with them. So anger and courage, contentiousness, battle, revenge, reprisal, these are all key things that are motivating these people here on the plains in front of Troy. And so anger is going to play a massive role within the Iliad. And we're going to look at it book by book by book and take some pauses here and there for mulling over or, asking questions or dialoguing about what actually happens in these great, stories that are being told. So, first off, anger has a role in ancient warfare. It helps people to get riled up and be ready to brave the danger of fighting hand to hand. It can motivate people to take necessary but dangerous action, to wade into the battle with their spears and swords and other armaments. Anger, is also aroused, as we're going to see at the very beginning, when somebody has a sense of being treated as less than they deserve, being, as we say, dishonored, a term that is going to come up quite a lot within the Iliad, particularly as Achilles views himself, I think quite rightly, as being dishonored by Agamemnon, the great war leader. And, it also arises in the course of disagreements about what really matters or how to understand things when people disagree with each other. We saw this when we discussed Plato in the very second session of this series. And then, once anger is aroused, we see it looking for satisfaction. We see it like a wound that can be poked and prodded and riled back up. We're going to see Achilles, for example, suggesting that Priam at the very end of the book, don't you get me angry again, and worrying about all these things that are going to happen if they do get angry. Anger also, it very interestingly provokes other emotional responses in other people. So we see Achilles' anger, for example, making other people feel fear or dread. Or sometimes we see characters expressing awe or amazement or sorrow or suffering, or in many cases, anger in return. I get angry at you, you get angry at me, right? So we also have, a world that's murky and messy. As I mentioned, there are no white hat good guys in this, right? And there aren't any complete villains either. It's a world in which there's some right on everybody's side, and it can't all be reconciled together, which you might say is making it a tragic piece, even though it's not considered Greek tragedy. And so anger and revenge is going to get involved in this. And one of the key tensions that we have that we're going to see worked out in this, and then I'll address this comment. All the Greeks are under the rule of one anax, one war leader, Agamemnon, right? The ruler of men, the king. But at the same time, they're also free. And so, each of them freely decides what they're going to do, of course, motivated by concerns of honor and glory and winning, prizes. So perhaps oriented by wealth as well, a desire for social status. So on the one hand, they're under orders. On the other hand, they are free people who can decide for themselves. And how is this all going to work out? And how do you apportion goods like honor? This is a key question there. So Mark has a comment. To me, the appeal of Achilles' story is his being an exemplary tragic hero. Okay, so coming back to this notion of tragedy, his glory is due to his martial excellence, his arete, but his Achilles' heel, is anger. Now that's very interesting. We'll come back to that in a moment. Courage and skill that is overshadowed at times by an anger associated with pride, the vice the hero risks. Even though we aren't Greek warriors, there are aspects in our lives where we grapple with similar tension between our virtue and weakness. Okay, those are some good observations. And we use this term Achilles heel to mean like a person who otherwise is quite resilient and strong, the vulnerable point at which they can be attacked and perhaps even brought down. If you think about biblical heroes, Samson and his hair, right? If you think about David and his lust, right? And in the case of Achilles, yes, it's his pride and his anger. He is not willing to be treated in the way that Agamemnon is treating him. So this is a good place to jump in and look at the central conflict that sets up everything else at the start. And we're going to see anger is going to arise on the part of multiple people, and anger is going to provoke other anger. So as I mentioned, we begin by hearing Menon Aida Theia, right? Rage goddess, sing of the rage of Peleus's son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls. Achilles, by his withdrawal from battle, is going to put the Greeks at a disadvantage. And then it goes on and says, begin Muse when the two first broke and clashed. What god drove them to fight with such a fury? And the words that are being used there are not so much anger words, but rather conflict words. We have eris, right, in the dative eridi, and as a noun, erisante. They got into strife with each other. They clashed. They became enemies to each other. They came into conflict. Why did this happen? Well, because Agamemnon has ticked off the god Apollo. And we're going to see this term over and over again coming up, holos. So this is a bit of a digression, but the anger vocabulary that we're going to see in Homer's Iliad isn't really using the main term that later Greek writers will use for anger, orge, right? And it's not even using the word thumos quite as much, something that we explored in great detail in Plato in our previous session, number 3. Instead, it's going to be holos and menis and a few other terms. Now, holos can mean bile, like what it is that the liver produces. The liver and black bile, melancholos, were viewed as being a location or source, or you could say the bodily component of the emotion of anger. So we're going to see this term coming up over and over again. And we see that the god is angered at Agamemnon, holothes, right? And imposes a disease, which Apollo can do very easily because he's the lord of diseases, onto the army, the Greek army, because of the treatment of his priest, whose daughter has been taken as a prize. And so, there's this terrible plague going on, and, the Achaeans are like, Agamemnon, you got to give her back. You've got to make things right between the god and us. And Agamemnon says, I'm not giving her back. So the priest prays. And after, and the priest is praying, the priest is himself angered and he's praying to the god. And so the god imposes this terrible pestilence. And on the 10th day, Achilles calls the army to muster into a group, right? And speaks to Agamemnon and suggests that they consult a prophet. So they do that. And the prophet Calchas explains Apollo's anger. And now the word here is menace. And the term that was used originally for Achilles' rage. So he's explaining Apollo's rage at the Greeks. But Calchas first asks Achilles to protect him, because he knows that he's going to anger Agamemnon, who is going to keep or literally digest the burning in his chest. Holon again, and katapepse. We get pepsis, as digestion later on. And so it's going to be like a heartburn, and Agamemnon might take it out on him. So then, after Achilles gives some assurances, Calchas says, well, Agamemnon has dishonored the god's priest. And the word that's actually used there, atimes, meaning time is honor and is taking away. So he's taken away the honor of the priest and thereby the honor of the god Apollo. And this is why he's suffering. Now, Agamemnon himself rises. He's upset or grieving or furious, depending on how you want to translate it. Achnumenos is the term there, and it says his dark heart filled to the brim, blazing with anger. And once again, we see menace as the term there. Meneos de mega phrenes, right? So his chest, his heart has been filled with great anger, and he says that he'll give the girl back, but now he demands a prize of value to himself. So he'll accept being told that he has to do something, but he wants to sort of like push the damage off onto somebody else. And he accuses Achilles of trying to cheat him. But interestingly, here at this point, he's not just singling out Achilles. He's sort of spreading it onto the great commanders. He says he'll take a prize from Achilles or from Ajax or Odysseus. Now, what's going on there? These are recognized as being the greatest of the Greek fighters. As a matter of fact, there's another one, Diomedes, that is going to like even be able to attack gods later on, who Agamemnon is going to say is not really as great a warrior as these other people. And so he says, I'm going to take their prize and let that man choke with anger. And the term there is keholosetai. So we have this holos again there, right? And it's being sort of like reinforced. Let that man be just filled with anger. Achilles then reminds Agamemnon of something pretty important. So this goes back to that tension that we were talking about earlier. The Trojans didn't do any wrong to Achilles, and so many others could say this as well. They are following Agamemnon, and Agamemnon doesn't dole out the prizes equally. And Achilles actually says, you know what? If you're going to act this way, I might leave town. I'm going to tell my guys, get back on their ships and screw you. You're on your own, jackass. He doesn't quite say it like that. And Agamemnon, you can see he's angered, right? Because what is the next thing he says? He's like, yeah, fine. Go if you want to go. Even if you're a great warrior, you don't matter to me. You're nothing to me, nor does your anger or grudge, your koteontos, being upset. And he says, I'll take your prize, Brises, so that you can learn how much greater I am than you. So what do we see here? We see social status once again, and Agamemnon is going to inflict a penalty on Achilles because Agamemnon himself is angered, and he's going to take revenge, no longer against the god, but against the person who has brought matters to a head. So this is clearly misdirected anger, and this angers Achilles. So this is where we get the rage of Achilles that was referenced at the beginning. And what we find is he's in a crisis. Achos. And here's the line. The heart in his rugged chest was pounding, torn. So he's got two different directions he could go. Should he draw the long sword slung at his hip, thrust through the ranks, and kill Agamemnon now, which is certainly a possibility for Achilles because he is the greatest, arguably, and demonstrably later on, of all of the Greek warriors. I mean, we could say maybe Ajax is his rival, but Ajax can't beat Hector and Achilles can, right? So if he wanted to go after Agamemnon, he could have done that. Or should he check his rage and beat his fury down? So here we have two different anger words, holos and thumon, being used, right? And what Achilles does is he begins to draw his blade, and now we get one of the first divine interventions. I suppose you could say it's the second divine intervention because Apollo has already intervened on the part of his priest, right? And of course, we have the prophet Calchas, who's consulting things as well. But what we have here is Athena is going to show up. Hera and Athena, both of them love Achilles, and Athena commands Achilles. She says, I came down from the skies to check your rage, your thumos, if you will only yield. And he does. He listens to the god. He tells Agamemnon then, you send other men into battle. You don't risk your own life, and I'm not going to fight for you anymore. And then we see Nestor, who is going to be an important character at several points. And remember that Nestor will show up in the Odyssey as well, not as Nestor, but as Athena disguised as Nestor. And Nestor is an old man who's very smart, and he pleads with both of these great leaders, telling Agamemnon to let his anger go against Achilles, because Achilles is a bulwark or wall against their foes. And then Agamemnon sends the men to take Brises from Achilles' camp. And this is where the action, you could say, ends. So the very first scene in the Iliad is of Agamemnon and Achilles clashing, the goddess intervening, and everything being set up. Achilles now will take himself out of action, and the Greeks, for a while, are going to be on their own. Now, here's a good comment: bile, indigestion, choking. I enjoy the visceral imagery of anger. Yeah, and so this is a little bit of a side note as well. One of the things that we see over and over and over again throughout the Iliad, and this may indeed lead to Plato's location of thumos later on in the chest, or the thorax, as they called it, is that we'll see the anger vocabulary using the terms menis or holos or occasionally thumos, and then it'll be, an anatomical and we could say psychological language as well, anger in the chest. But it's also, associated with this notion of bile, of digestion, of like nursing your anger inside your guts, so to speak. So you're right, visceral imagery. I mean, visceral in more than one sense, right? So let's go on. And we do have something that's kind of an interesting little comic interlude in book 2. And I wanted to bring it up in part because what we see here is not anger, although we could read it in if we wanted to. And what we have here is this guy, Thersites, who is the ugliest, a deformed guy who utters abuse and obscenities and baits the various, great leaders. He's the comic relief, right? And interestingly in this, there isn't going to be any comic relief. The only comic relief is Odysseus, actually, when Thersites goes after Agamemnon and is taunting him. Odysseus threatens to strip and beat him, and then takes Agamemnon's scepter, his symbol of rulership, and beats him with the scepter. And everybody's laughing now, no longer along with Thersites at the rulers and the powerful warriors. They're laughing at Thersites, and they all think that he's getting what he deserves. And this is sort of a bonding moment for them at the expense of Thersites. Now, what I think is really quite extraordinary about this, you would expect to read some anger language in this scene, like Agamemnon getting ticked off and saying, "Take care of this guy," right? Or Thersites himself being angry, or Odysseus being angry. We don't see any anger language being used here. What we do see is punishment, or perhaps you could say retaliation and revenge, but we don't see any anger. And, later on, we're going to see that there's a lot of discussions in literature about how laughing or comedy sometimes can lead to anger, but sometimes can help us to dispel anger. So, I think that's probably enough said about that. In book 4, we get this incredible association, or it's called the Council of the Gods, right? And the gods have been taking sides in the Trojan War, not least because, as we learn later on, not in the Iliad, but in the Odyssey, the whole war was started in part over the goddess of discord, Eris, a term that we've already encountered, having this golden apple, and the goddesses, it's to the fairest. Paris decides for Aphrodite. Athena and Hera are pissed off, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna see some sort of punishment here. And then, of course, the human affairs, taking Helen, the vow that all the Greeks had made to Menelaus when he married Helen, that if anybody stole her, they'd all help out. And Menelaus, of course, is the brother to Agamemnon. They sail to Troy, and now the gods have been, engaging in the conflict through human proxies for quite a long time. And Athena and Hera are the ones who most want the destruction of Troy. And what we see going on here in the story is Zeus says something, and Athena is silent, but she's resentful at Zeus. She is angry, but she keeps her anger, checked. Hera, however, the wife of Zeus, queen of the gods, she cannot contain her anger in her breast. Again, she has holon, and it's not contained, stathos, within her chest. And she criticizes Zeus's plan for truce. Why? Because he is meddling and undoing the work that she has done. The work is killing Trojans. And Zeus then gets angry himself. The Greek there is meg okthesas, right? Another anger word. And he criticizes Hera's own insatiable anger and suggests that she had better not interfere with his fury when he wants to destroy a city. And Hera raises the stakes. She says, you know what? You can destroy my 3 favorite cities, and I won't resist. Let me destroy this city, though. What are her favorite cities? Argos and Sparta and Mycenae. And so Zeus then sends Athena, who's, looking for trouble, down to break the truce, disguised as a Trojan. And she suggests that an archer should shoot an arrow at Menelaus. And then the truce is broken and the war resumes. So the anger that's felt on the part of the gods bleeds over into resumption of the conflict and fury and anger on both sides. And what we see then, we're going to skip over a number of books, is all sorts of cool battles going on, some of which are concerned with Diomedes, and we see Ajax doing things. But the war is not going great for the Greeks, the Achaeans. So we should pause here for a minute, see if there's any questions, comments, things to take note of, dig deeper into, and then we'll jump into looking at, in the middle of the book, Agamemnon admitting his mistake, but Achilles not responding the way that he wants to. So here's a good point. God's getting angry. No wonder Socrates denounced them. Yeah, and I mean, there were other Greek thinkers. The first person that comes to mind is Epicurus, who's, a later generation, of course. But his principal doctrines begin by saying the gods don't get angry. It's not becoming of them. Clearly, Socrates he did introduce new notions of the gods, right? Which could have been impiety. Plato certainly didn't think that the gods should be depicted as getting angry. And we have other philosophers, and it's primarily philosophers who are saying that's modeling the gods after us. The gods are not as screwed up as us. For Homer, clearly the gods are as screwed up as us. They're just much, much more powerful and immortal, right? So this is kind of an interesting point, right? And we could pause on this a moment, because we're going to talk later on about the gods getting angry again at each other. And, think about what it's suggesting to you as a reader or as a hearer of these tales. So it's kind of a pessimistic viewpoint on anger. There's nothing like therapy of the soul. There's nothing like anger management other than just don't let your anger get away with you, or let's not tick people off. So we've got approaches to anger in a very rudimentary sense when it comes to rational approaches to anger. Instead, they're all mostly either avoidance or appeasement, or we've got to let the anger go where it's going to go. Gods are morally neutral, like a force of nature. Yeah, I mean, or you could say that the line between good and bad runs through the gods. They're kind of mixtures of both. I mean, they will make moral arguments to each other. You shouldn't behave this way. Or they have responses of moral emotions. Like we said, Zeus himself gets angry at Hera over her anger and her expression of anger. So clearly he thinks that it's not good for her, or she's somehow shaming him by showing this anger, right? So yeah, the gods are an interesting topic. Let's go to book 9 now. So what do we see here? Diomedes is going to oppose Agamemnon and says to spare him his anger, that Agamemnon has not shown courage, and that if he wants to leave, he can, but the Greeks will stay and fight, because Agamemnon now is actually threatening to like take off himself. And Nestor speaks up once again and says, it's time for you to make things right with Achilles. And he tells him that in your anger, Agamemnon, you have dishonored a great man, namely Achilles. And then Agamemnon, interestingly, because he is a real anger-driven jerk, right? He admits that he was insane, blinded, angered, but now he's going to make things right. And the way that he's going to do it is by promising and providing gifts, as they call it, a ransom for friendship. And he promises the restoration of Briseis, his prize, to him. He also mentions that he hasn't slept with her, and he says, if Troy falls, I'll also give you all sorts of really great war booty as well. And I'll do this if Achilles just ends his anger. Metalexanti holoio, once again, holos, this bile expression. So he sends an embassy, and it includes Nestor, and it includes another older man, Phoenix, and Ajax and Odysseus, and Patroclus and Achilles welcome them as guests to their camp. And then Odysseus is going to make his argument. He says, the Trojans are close to beating us, and they're going to be up to our ships pretty soon. There's still time. Let your heart-devouring anger go. And again, they use this term holos. And he says, Agamemnon is going to give you all sorts of gifts to make things right. And you can also gain glory, the greatest glory, by killing Hector, the hero of the Trojans. And Achilles responds to him and says that he hates a person who says one thing and hides another in his heart, and that Agamemnon and the Greeks are not going to win him over. He suffered years for them in a war against people who aren't his enemy. And then the war leader took his honor and his prize. He'll even now consider sailing back home. So Odysseus's appeal is clearly unsuccessful. Achilles is still angry. And then Phoenix says that Achilles is being mastered by his anger. And he brings up a case from his own backstory, an incident when he and his father were at odds in anger, and he considered killing his father, and a god checked his anger, and the kin kept him there feasting for, I think it was 9 days, and then he took off. And he continues, and he says, it's wrong to have an iron, ruthless heart. Look at the gods, even they can be appeased. If Agamemnon was still angry and not offering gifts, then it would be fine for you, Achilles, to stay angry at him. But Agamemnon is making a good faith effort to try to produce a reconciliation. So you should do your part, Achilles, and, accept the apology and the prizes and rejoin us. And Achilles says no. Then Ajax suggests that they should leave because they're unsuccessful. And he says Achilles is just savage. He doesn't think of his companions. The gods, notice that he's going to blame this on the gods, have planted cruel, relentless fury in his chest. So again, kakon to thumon, thumos, anger, right? Kakon, bad, evil, and it's planted enstathesy in your chest. And Achilles then says, when I recall how Agamemnon treated me, dishonoring me not just privately, but in front of all the Greeks, my heart is filled with anger. And so they leave, and then they go and tell Agamemnon that Achilles is still full of anger, and he spurns him and his gifts. And there's nothing that Agamemnon can do now at this point, right? And the Greeks are fighting against the Trojans. And as we know, what's going to happen is things are going to get particularly desperate. Patroclus, who is Achilles' best friend and probably lover, certainly looked at that way in later literature, puts on Achilles' armor, goes out, and Hector strikes him down. And not only does he strike him down, he, as we find out in book 18, they're fighting over his corpse. They're trying to get it back. His corpse has been stripped of the armor. Hector now has not only taken his friend's life, but also Achilles' own arms. And Achilles falls into a deep grief. Interestingly, his first response is not that of anger. Let me go out there and kill this son of a bitch. It's grief for what he has lost. And then he gets to the point where he's like, yeah, I'm going to go and fight this guy. And then his mother, the immortal nymph Thetis, warns him, if you kill Hector, you're going to die soon after. And Achilles laments the strife and the anger that brought him there. And we get this really, really famous passage that we're going to see people quoting throughout antiquity, which brings up anger sweeter than honey swarming in people's chests, blinding like smoke. Hostopoluglukion melitos, right? So melitos, mel is honey, and glukion means sweeter than. Aristotle himself will bring this up in his discussions of anger. And Achilles is reflecting on how did things get so screwed up? How did things get to this point? Well, my anger is part of that. And it's interesting because what we notice happening, if we're reading between the lines and we're looking at the way Homer has Achilles talking about things, his anger is something that overcomes him. His anger is something that arises. It's also something that he can stand back from and consider at a distance. And this is going to be coming up again later on. So maybe there is a lesson there for us to learn. Achilles then cleans and washes his friend's body and mourns him. And Hephaestus, asked by Thetis, makes arms for Achilles. And we get this very famous passage that we're going to skip over, where it describes the shield of Achilles in great detail. Homer was apparently very into that, and the ancient Greeks were as well. But we're interested in the workings of anger. And so this is going to lead to a reconciliation in book 19 between Achilles and Agamemnon. So they are brought back in the same place. And Achilles tells Agamemnon, was it better for you and I to rage at each other, raked by anguish, consumed by strife, all for a young girl, the prize, Briseis, right? Achilles now has perspective. So does Agamemnon. And, what do we see here? There's a recognition that their conflict wasn't really necessary, and it was over the wrong sorts of things. And Achilles tells us he will call a halt to his anger, grieving for Patroclus. He will bring an end to the anger in his breast, thumon eni stathesi. And he also uses in this passage the words holon and menin. So we have all the anger vocabulary located in Achilles' chest. He's going to bring a halt to it. Then Agamemnon says something. There's a lot of blaming on, things on the gods. Agamemnon blames things on the gods in this case, namely ruin or Ate. And he says that this god Ate compelled him to take Achilles' prize. And then we get an interesting exchange. Odysseus, Achilles is like, all right, let's go fight now. And Odysseus is like, well, no, let's have a little meal. Let's have a feast, right? Let's commemorate this. And also, we shouldn't fight on an empty stomach. We should get ourselves back in gear. Agamemnon, for his part, wants to give gifts to Achilles. He's trying to reconcile again. But Achilles wants to go out and fight. And he says, all of that feasting and stuff, that can wait until a lull in the battle when I don't have fury in my chest or in my heart. And again, he uses the term menace and sthesi, and he says that his taste is for slaughter and blood and groans of men. So what are we seeing here? Achilles is motivated now still by anger, but the anger has been redirected at the Trojans, away from Agamemnon and the Greeks who are going along with Agamemnon's mistreating of him. That is now dealt with, and now he's full of anger, full of fury to go after the Trojans, and specifically Hector, their greatest hero. So here's an interesting remark. You mentioned laughter earlier. Maybe Achilles could have done more damage to Agamemnon with a cutting wit than his rage. Yeah, and if Achilles had been, say, Odysseus, right? Odysseus is good at that sort of thing. Not all the Greek heroes are, you know. You get the idea that Achilles is much quicker with his sword and his spear than he is with his wits. And that's definitely the case for the greater Ajax too, who becomes, you know, a great rival to Odysseus. Odysseus is smarter than the rest of them, and a great fighter too, but he's more a person of thought. Odysseus is, by the way, sort of a, you know, let's call him somebody in between the great, you know, we call, you know, in role-playing games, they call the fighters tanks, right? Tanks like Ajax and Achilles, and the great thinker types like Nestor or Phoenix. Odysseus has got it both. But, you know, there's a whole other story where he's the main character that we'll talk about maybe down the line when we reprise Homer. But yeah, a cutting remark could have maybe dealt with things, but they don't need to make any remarks like that at this point, because the Achaeans are reconciled with each other, and Achilles is ready to go out and fight and kill, and that is indeed what he does. And so we see in book 21, he is filling up the river Xanthos with blood. And so book 20 ended with this brutal, relentless assault of Achilles on the Trojans. Nobody can stand up to him. He's killing guys left and right. And then we get this really interesting scene. Lycaon begs for his life. He says, you know, killing me, it's not really going to do anything. And Achilles says, you know, before Patroclus's death, I might have granted you mercy, but I'm not going to do it now. Get ready to die. Death waits for all of us. I'm going to die. You're going to die. You're just going to die sooner at my hand. And he starts killing Trojans, and there's all these depictions about how he's doing it. And the blood is flowing into the river, and the river is going to get angry itself. Potamosta, hola santo, Kerothi malon, oresemend anathumon hopos pausae, right? The river is getting angry at Achilles for making things too messy, and it takes a human shape. And it says it's going to stop Achilles. It tells him, you know, you're greater than any man on earth, but you're also greater in outrage, in hubris. And so the two of them fight, and what ends up happening is Achilles jumps into the river, and the river is fighting him with all of its resources, a whirlpool that's sucking him down. Poseidon and Athena and Hera all get involved, and Hera saves Achilles from the whirlpools. Otherwise, the river would have presumably have killed him. Hephaestus actually uses fire against the river. So the gods now are fighting on the side of Achilles, or at least some of them, right? Because what then ends up happening, total war, God against God. Ares fighting against Athena. Athena beats Ares, two gods of war, right? One, the maid representing strategy, the other bloodthirsty son of Hera, fighting against each other. Aphrodite actually has to take Ares away after he loses. Poseidon and Apollo fight each other. Hera goes after Artemis. So we have all of these divine forces now lined up against each other. It's no longer just Trojan versus Achaean with the gods, advising them or helping them out every once in a while. The gods themselves are fighting each other. And then we get to book 22, and we have this, classic scene between the two greatest heroes on the battlefield, Achilles and Hector. Hector knows he's going to die, and he begs Achilles one thing. He doesn't say, "Spare my life." He asks for proper funeral rites. Once again, we see Achilles saying, before Patroclus, before you screwed with the guy that I care about, I would have been merciful to you. But he says to him something really dramatic. "Would to God my rage, my fury would now drive me to hack your flesh away and eat you raw." His rage against the killer of his friend is so great that he's threatening cannibalism. He's threatening not just to dishonor the corpse, not to give it proper funeral rites, but to himself as an agent to his rage, his fury would allow him to cut off parts of the person's body, living or dead, and consume them. So this is pretty, out of control anger there. And he kills Hector. And then, in order to perhaps vent his rage, he allows the other Greeks to come through and stab Hector's body, essentially just filling it with holes. And then he strips the corpse, as Hector did to his friend, Patroclus, but he binds it to the chariot that he's riding, and he drives around the city, essentially defiling the corpse, right? Showing that he's going to destroy Hector, not just in battle, not just with a blow, but to ruin his body. And this is what anger often, drives people to do, to take brutal, desperate revenge against those who they view as having violated norms. And then we get to the, sort of the ending of all of this. We see that Achilles has dishonored the corpse. Priam, who has lost now all of his great sons, is going to try to get the body back. His life has essentially been ruined. And so Priam talks first with Hermes, who is disguised as one of Achilles' warriors, one of his myrmidons. And they tell him that there's been something quite extraordinary happening. We could call it a miracle if we wanted. Hector's corpse is still lying by the ships, but it hasn't been scavenged by birds or dogs, and it's not rotting. And so this gives Priam, I won't say hope, but at least heart to go and ask, or rather beg, for his son's body back. And Priam goes and meets with Achilles, and he suggests his argumentative tactic here is that he remember his own father and pity Priam, who has lost so much in the process. And here we get one of the scenes that so many people will bring to mind as being something absolutely of central importance to the Iliad. Both of them grieve. They grieve together. Priam is grieving for his son Hector, killed by Achilles. Achilles is grieving for his father, who is like Priam, and he's grieving for Patroclus, killed by Hector. And they grieve together. And Priam then once again asks for his son, and Achilles says something really extraordinary here, especially in relation to his anger. Remember that I said that Achilles, at a certain point, was able to sort of stand back from his anger, realizing that it could control him if he allowed it to. So Achilles tells Priam in response to being asked for the body, do not tempt my wrath. Don't reawaken it. But he says also, I made up my mind to give you your son's body back. So don't ask me for what I've already decided upon. And Achilles has the body then bathed and anointed. And we get another really extraordinary insight here in book 24. Achilles is himself worried that Priam is going to get angered at seeing his son's defiled body. Now, what does he have to fear from Priam? Nothing. Priam is an old man. Priam can't hurt him. Achilles is worried that he is going to, in response to Priam's anger, himself get angered. His anger will arise again, and that he will then hurt Priam as a result. So we see, some real reflective insight on the part of Achilles. He understands that anger could take control of him, and he wants to avoid that with a former enemy. Achilles then picks up Hector himself, and he places him on the funeral bier. And then he says one other thing, and this is the last thing that we have to say about anger coming from all of these books. He says to his friend Patroclus, who is now dead and presumably in the underworld, he says, feel no anger at me, Patroclus, that he's been given a ransom for the loss of Patroclus, and he's going to give Patroclus his share of that ransom, presumably through sacrifice, through appeasing the dead. And what do we have here? We have a landscape that has been dominated by anger and its effects for so long, the devastation brought about by it, in terms of so many people killed, mutilated, terrorized, but also the damage that has been done within to these warriors. And we have an overcoming, or at least a cessation of this terrible force of anger on the part of those who are still alive, and now, to some degree at least, reconciled with each other. And so that is the Iliad and the great theme of anger within it. We see that there's a number of different points, and anybody can get angry. Some more than others. Achilles can get very angry. Agamemnon can get very angry. Many other people, even rivers and gods and people like that. Presumably, Odysseus is a little bit better at holding on to his anger, but even he will, get ticked off from time to time as well. So, good thing to think about here. Are there lessons being taught through the way this story is told? I would say yes, but it's things that you have to reflect upon. There's nothing here about like how to manage your anger with techniques or stuff like that, or theoretical anger is working this way or that way, as we'll see in later philosophers. But I think that the examples, the negative examples being provided, are probably very helpful. Thinking about why people get angry, dishonor, things being taken from them, having somebody killing people in your waters on the part of the river, right? Somebody basically muddying you up. How to get some distance from or perspective upon your anger, when you should reconcile and when you shouldn't. These are all, I think, valuable, if not lessons, perhaps topics. So that is all that I had lined up by way of lecture. Here's an interesting question. Greg, you're a veteran. Did the Iliad impact your understanding of being a soldier? Anger seems like something you'd want to learn to control if serving in the military. Yeah, so that's a great topic, right? And this is where a lot of misunderstandings arise on the part of people who idealize or idolize the military. You don't want angry people in battle. You want people who can actually keep a cool head. And this is something that ancient philosophers noted. Aristotle talks about this. He also, or Seneca talks about this. Plutarch talks about this. All the people that are like attentive to anger, they're like, you know, it's not a great idea to go into battle super angry. It might give you some temporary energy or motivation or daring, but it leads you into making dumb decisions, right? And in the modern battlefield, where so much is being done at a distance, it's not really helpful to get angry or even to just get irritated. I mean, there's so many things that could irritate you in the modern battlefield: being under fire, your friends dying, crappy food, bad conditions, stupid officers who don't know what they're doing, right? We could go on and on and on and on. But anger doesn't work as a particularly good motivating force, and it tends to produce a lack of cohesion among the people that you're supposed to be working with. Now, if your battlefield is all hand-to-hand combat, maybe, you know, like in the Greek times, the heroic age, maybe there's a role for it. But we notice already that with people like, for example, Seneca point out that, you know, the nations that allow anger, thumos, whatever we want to call it, to dominate, they actually are scary but crappy fighters because they can't fight in formation properly, right? So like they can't do a phalanx, they can't do a Roman maniple or whatever else it's going to be. And they're scary at the start, but they break down pretty quickly. So that's a good question. Any other questions, comments, things that people want to bring up? I will say that it was very enjoyable rereading the Iliad for, you know, preparing for this discussion, because such a great work of literature, such great characterization of the people involved. And, you know, they're being presented heroically, but as I pointed out, they're not being idealized. They're not being turned into stock figures. You know, Achilles really is struggling. Agamemnon is kind of a jerk, oblivious to what he's doing, and he's sometimes a good leader and a lot of times not a good leader, and he has to be counseled by the other people. And there is this tension of, well, we're under orders, but we're also free people. And you know, not only does Achilles suggest that he might pull up and leave, even Agamemnon, as I pointed out, is like, yeah, you know, been here a long time. You guys are a bunch of jerks. Maybe I'll take off, right? And Diomedes has to say to him, yeah, go ahead. You know, you're a crappy leader anyway. Here's a good one. I thought the Troy movie was fun. Would a more faithful adaptation of the Iliad as the short series be something that interests you? Yeah, faithful adaptation. I mean, this is something that we could say about so many bits of literature, even down to, you know, 20th century speculative fiction stuff. If you formed a very strong attachment to the original text, then it kind of bothers you oftentimes to see them being butchered, being done badly, right? And you can even say there's a bit of anger in us that sometimes rises on behalf of the author, on behalf of the work. Now, you know, sometimes this can be kind of silly. I remember as a kid, having to be told, because I went and saw Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom with my mother and sister and some family friends, and coming out of the theater and people saying, how did you like it? And I was like, that was terrible. The Thuggies weren't remotely like that, and then they very quickly like rolled their eyes and they're like, Greg's on his bullshit again, can't you just watch a movie? Now that in that case, getting upset about a bad caricature of a religious sect in India, probably over the line, right? Seeing crappy adaptations where they really, really missed the mark of classic or contemporary great literature. I don't know, maybe if not anger, maybe we should feel something about that, like a sense of indignation. Why didn't they do this better? And usually the answer is something simple like, well, they didn't think the audience would be able to follow it, or they thought that a love interest was needed, or we had to stick to the Hollywood formula or something along those lines. But yeah, a short, faithful adaptation of the Iliad would be really cool. One that, spent enough time on the different heroes and actually found ways to depict the gods in conflict with each other, in imaginative ways. That would be pretty awesome, I think. You want it. So this goes back to something. This is a bit of a side note. One of the things that Aristotle points out in his Poetics, because he's talking about tragedy, is that he identifies 6 elements of it, and the 3 that are particularly important for poetry are plot, mythos, the story, what happens, what's going on, right? And a lot of times adaptations are okay at that, although they simplify the plots considerably. And then character, ethos, right? And this is how the people display their character, their virtues and vices, through their choices, their words, their actions, their thoughts, right? And that is where a lot of times the typical American productions of things start to fail. They present Achilles as a different kind of guy than he is. They present Agamemnon as a different kind of guy than he is, right? They want to simplify the characters. They want to turn things into, if not all white and black hats, at least the kinds of anti-heroes that we already know about. And then we have another really, really, really important dimension that Aristotle can't stress enough: thought, dianoia. The people in the story say things that express their frame of mind. They make arguments, they make appeals, they explain what they're doing. And a lot of times in Hollywood stuff, this is done through like info dumps, or there'll be like a setup for a motivation. They'll talk about some, traumatic event that happened that they're trying to work their way through. But that's not all that. Hollywood people think that's what makes things relatable. I think that actually hearing people say interesting things is more relatable, even if we're distanced from them by culture and time and, social class, and pick whatever else you want. I think letting Achilles actually speak for himself in a proper way would be quite compelling, hearing what the guy thinks and has to say. And the same thing with Hector, and the same thing with Odysseus, and the same thing with Ajax, and going on and on and on. So that's a bit of a digression, but great question. So any other questions, comments as we wrap this up? Again, I'll say that I really enjoyed, I don't know how many times I've read the Iliad over the course of my life, but it's one of those texts that you can tell it's a classic because it just keeps getting better each time that you read it, looking forward to going back to the Odyssey, which I like better than the Iliad because, I'm a big fan of Odysseus. All right, here's one from Mark. Any good heavy metal songs about the Iliad you know of? No, but I'm sure there's plenty out there, you know. I really only know classic heavy metal well, and there's all sorts of obscure bands that I don't know of that you can find out there, some of whom probably have written about, produced songs that have to do with at least something from the Iliad. So I'm sure there's stuff out there. I'm just not a great one for doing it. Oh, here's an interesting follow-up. I'm surprised Iron Maiden hasn't done a song on it. Yeah, you're right. If there was any high stature classic metal band that loved to do historically focused stuff, particularly about war, it would be Iron Maiden, right? I mean, if it was Saxon, it would be about modes of transportation like wheels of steel, things like 747s. Judas Priest doesn't really do a lot of that sort of stuff. Neither does Motorhead, but Iron Maiden, they love doing those historically founded things. If they're going to do Alexander the Great, why not do a song about Achilles? Achilles and Agamemnon, standing toe to toe, one of them about to strike the other down, and Athena showing up. That's like tailor-made for an Iron Maiden song. So that might actually be a good place to bring this to a close on kind of a interesting high note. So thanks for all the great comments. We'll be resuming next month, talking about Hesiod and works and days, and perhaps getting into the Theogony as well. And then after that, we're going to go back to philosophers again, which will be quite fun. So that is it for this one.